So what I'm going to talk about, my title is I Teach My Son to Hate Dr. Seuss and Why You Should Too, and that's me, Koji Sakai. Part one is, it sucks being Asian in the 80s and 90s. There's no better time to be a young Asian Pacific Islander American than today. Don't believe me? Let's go back in time. Way, 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 way back in time when the dinosaurs ruled the earth. I'm kidding. I was born in 1977, which for those of you who aren't good at math, and how could you not, you're mostly Asian here, means I'm 42 years young. I grew up in the 80s and I came of age in the 90s. Back then, the only Asian face on television or in movies was the socially awkward nerd, the martial arts master, the foreign villain, or the geisha. That's not totally true. There were some Asian folks on the screen. They included actors like Tia Carrera, Brandon Lee, Mako, Nobuko McCarthy, Pat Morita, James Shigeta, and of course Tamlin Tomita, who was probably my first celebrity crush. Probably the most popular movie I remember watching as a kid that had Asian American people were the first two Karate Kids. However, I knew even back then that the movie was filled with Asian stereotypes that made me cringe. Other movies with Asians included films such as Gung Ho, Rising Sun, Showdown in Little Tokyo, and Big Trouble in Little China. What do you guys notice about these posters? I believe it's telling that even though these movies take place either in Asia or in Asian areas of America, the posters feature very few Asian faces. It wasn't all bad. There were movies like The Joy Luck Club, The Wedding Banquet, and The Picture Bride, but all those movies came out in the 90s. In terms of popular music, Hiroshima's about it. And they played adult jazz, and I never listened to adult jazz. There was also the Mountain Brothers, a group from Philadelphia in 1999, and Jin, 2004. He was the first Asian American signed to a major record label, signed to a major record label. But these guys came out after I graduated college. The only Asian American sports star was Olympic hero Christy Yamaguchi, but I was a boy and I hated figure skating. So my hero is Hideo Nomo, but he was from Japan and not Asian American. I grew up playing with G.I. Joe, and it was pathetic that I had to pretend that Storm Shadow, that's him, was a hero, was one of the good guys. Here's a funny side story. I was doing research recently, and I assumed he was Asian because he was a ninja. But in reality, his backstory was that he's a white dude. But the main image I had of APIAs were the porn stars I watched and I fantasized about. That's the connection to the previous speaker. This woman's name was Mimi Miyagi. The irony is that she's not Japanese, and she capitalized on the Karate Kid name. Part of the reason there weren't a lot of APIs, though, was due to racism, but also due to the fact there just wasn't a lot of us. Look at these stats. 1980, 1.44%. 1990, we were 2.78%. In the year 2000, we were 3.93%. But it wasn't all bad for me. Every school I went to as a kid was at least 40% Asian, which meant that I felt comfortable in my Asian American skin. It also meant that even though when I looked at popular media and there wasn't anyone that looked like me, it was okay because when I looked around, everybody around me was Asian American, just like me. Then I went to San Marino High School when I turned 15. It was the first school where the majority of the students were Asian and American. It was also the tail end of the transformation from a pretty much all-white school to an all-Asian ones. Tension between the two groups were really high. I'd never been in that situation. Before that, at all my other schools, everyone was pretty cool with each other. But San Marino was really the first time that I felt Asian. It was the first time that I felt the sting of being different. The irony, of course, is that it happened at a place where 65% of the students were Asian. This realization eventually turned me into a professional Asian American. That's what my wife calls me. I'm pretty sure she was making fun of me. But I've taken it as a source of pride because I've dedicated much of my life to telling the Asian American story. As the Vice President of Programs at the Japanese and American National Museum, I was dedicated to telling the story of Asian Americans and Japanese Americans. As a filmmaker, I've written and produced 2 feature films, The People I've Slept With and #1 Serial Killer. But even I got burned out. It didn't help that I got death threats when I made a movie called Chink, which is the original title of #1 Serial Killer. Don't get me wrong, I knew it was going to be controversial. I just didn't realize Asian Americans would want me dead because of it. After #1 Serial Killer, I promised myself I'd never make another Asian American movie again. Then I started thinking about my legacy of my son. Thinking of him made me reflect on my career as a and my legacy as a writer and filmmaker. It was during this time I realized that it was the Asian American projects that I'd be most proud of 30 years from now. All this got me thinking about Asian American identity and how I could pass it on to my son. The world of Asian Pacific Islanders today is different. Between 2000 and 2010, we are estimated to go from about 4.5% to 7.6%. That does not include Hapas or Pacific Islanders. That's a 213% increase, 49% over the same time. What does that mean in real numbers? That's 8% of the overall population. And in places like California, we already make up 15%. With that population rise, we also see more API faces on television and films. First, we got Fresh Off the Boat, which was the first Asian American sitcom in forever. And last year, we got Crazy Rich Asians, which was the highest grossing romantic comedy in the last 6 years. We also have celebrities now. Randall Park, Constance Wu, Awkwafina, John Cho, Daniel Day Kim, et cetera, et cetera. We have people that we could talk about. And likewise, we have APIs in popular music. Bruno Mars, Far East Movement. Side story about Far East Movement. I was telling an older person here at the museum that a #1 song on iTunes was an Asian group, and he thought I was crazy. That's how revolutionary that was, that an Asian American rap group was #1. We also have sports stars. Chloe Kim, Kurt Suzuki, Jeremy Lin. By the way, Jeremy Lin, the first Asian American to win an NBA title. Even our former president was Asian. Well, kinda. He was from Hawaii. He lived in Indonesia. If anything, he's the first Pacific president. The Honorable Norman Mineta, he was the first Asian American in the presidential cabinet. We hadn't had an Asian American in the White House until he did so in 2000. Since then, we've had 6 more: Elaine Chao, Neil Kashkari, Gary Locke, Stephen Chu, Ari Shinseki, and Nikki Haley. But on a broader scale, I believe authenticity is becoming more and more important. What do I mean by authenticity? Authenticity is the quality of being genuine or real. Young folks value authenticity in ways that people did not when I was a kid. Let me explain. When I was a kid, orange chicken was real Chinese food, and white people could play Asian people. Now kids eat sushi and demand authenticity in ways not dreamed of when I was younger. Evan Rachel Wood was cast to do a role as a Hiroshima bomb survivor, but it was controversial at that moment. So let's talk about Dr. Seuss. That's why we're here. Dr. Seuss is a racist. So how do I raise a strong Asian American kid? How do you teach him to be proud of who he is and also survive in the Trump White House world? I'm a dad of a 7-year-old Asian American, a 5th-generation Japanese American. So let me tell you a quick story. When I was growing up, I would go to people's houses in San Marino, and they would tell me their grandparents hated me because of something Japan did in the war, which I understand. My son will never have to do that. In fact, he shares more in common with that great-grandmother's grandson than anybody, and with my son, than anybody from our ancestral homelands. So how do I teach pride to my child? How do I teach him to be prideful of his identity? The most important thing I do is talk about race. I was on a panel once where a person said that they don't talk about race with their child. I told them I don't have the luxury to do that. If my kid just looks around the mirror, he knows he's different. And with that difference has to come with an understanding. He has to understand that the assumptions people make of him, both good and bad, because he's Asian, and maybe more importantly, I try to counter the stereotypes that I see that will consciously or unconsciously affect him. I tell him he's smart, a good Asian stereotype, but I also tell him he's strong, a bad Asian stereotype. I tell him he can do anything he wants, he just has to work for it. The next thing is I teach him about our history. I believe that in order to build a stronger future, he needs to know what happened before. I started early with my son. I took him on a family vacation to Manzanar, which is in Lone Pine. That's one of the 10 camps during World War II. At first, my son, he just wanted to go back and watch TV in the hotel. And then he watched the video and he started crying, and I knew I had him. But this just wasn't one thing. I constantly remind him. So every time we go past a place here in Los Angeles where Asian Americans and Japanese Americans like myself were incarcerated, I tell them that's where they locked up our people. So this is Santa Anita Racetrack, Pomona Fairgrounds, Latuna Canyon, and Griffith Park. That's all also places that they held Japanese Americans. This is why Dr. Seuss is not allowed in my house. If you don't know, in World War II, Dr. Seuss drew anti-Japanese American cartoons. And before you try to excuse it, he wasn't working for the government. He was doing this hate all on his own. I use Dr. Seuss as a symbol of the hate that was directed at us once, directed us still. I don't want to shield him from that. Instead, I want him to recognize it and go into the world with his eyes open and therefore stronger. I want him to build an even brighter future for Asian Americans. And the only way to do that is for him to have a strong base from which to jump from. And that's all I'm trying to do. Thank you.